Good morning. How are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit. Welcome back to another video. Today I'm joined by Chris Warren, and we are going to get a little nerdy talking about ranges, and more specifically, kind of crafting an out of position range when facing a 3-bet preflop. So, Chris, ready to get rocking and rolling?
Let's do it.
Excellent. All right, so let's kind of frame this around a discussion of playing six max. You open raise from the hijack, the button three bets you, everyone else folds back to you, and you're deciding what you want to do. So let's start by talking about the two major ranges that we have over at Red Chip Poker, the core range and the pro range in this exact situation. Why don't you start by walking us through the core range and kind of what we're looking at here and what we're kind of suggesting players should do in this spot.
Yeah, so basically, in general, when we're looking at getting 3-bet out of position, I think the thing that you have to understand is that this is a bad situation in poker. It's very difficult to defend, and basically you just have to play pretty tight and aggressive. And that's the only way that you can defend it. So I think a lot of people will be surprised at how tight the continuance range here we have both is for 4-betting and calling. Most people are probably going to lean on calling too many hands and not 4-betting enough hands. So if you look at our core ranges, this is basically our beginner friendly ranges. We found if you look over at our pro ranges on the right there, most players are not comfortable playing a range like that, especially when they start. It's just, there's too many weird situations where they're going to be out of position, sort of a middle strength hand. And it doesn't feel like it works for most people when they're really starting out. That is kind of the optimal range there on the right with pro. But with the core ranges, like this is a very stable, protected set of ranges. And if you do this, you'll be fine. It's not a huge deal. And, in fact, you'll probably be ahead of like even some higher stakes, small stakes games where players are just not that comfortable 4-betting out of position. So yeah, if you look at this range, it's a pretty simple and straightforward range where you're going to be just 4-betting queens plus ace queen. And then you can kind of consider if you feel comfortable enough to 4-bet the ace queen off and the jacks. And the reason why you might really consider that is that when we're out of position, we have a positional disadvantage that will play out over future decisions post-flop. Everyone kind of understands that position has value. However, that's really based on the fact that there's going to be multiple decision points that this positional advantage can be applied on. That gets mitigated when you 4-bet and raise and increase the size of the pot before the flop, even if, it's kind of like your middle strength hand, maybe you're getting only a little bit of value 4-betting jacks or ace queen or whatever. It creates this larger pot size where there's fewer decisions. And so that's one of the concepts that kind of plays out when you start looking at and learning these ranges is that, like when I'm out of position, I actually do 4-bet a bit more. And I'm calling only very, very strong hands at that point. It's pretty interesting.
It is. And it may seem a little bit weird because when we compare that to, say, the pro range, right, which has a lot more blue, and by the way, the 4-betting hands are in blue, the calls are in the yellow, and then the purple are the optional kind of at your discretion hands. And when you look at pro, we essentially have a range that is 4-betting about twice as often as the core range, right? So the core range, both of them are still kind of that 8% range of hands, but core is going to have a larger density of calls. Pro is going to have a larger density of 4-bets. And talk a little bit about why we're doing that. Like what goes into having a much more increased 4-betting percentage in the pro range.
Yeah, so basically we just know, our pro ranges are based on the GTO ranges that you actually see on the right here. They're just sort of a simplified version of that. But basically, we really don't want to be playing hands out of position in large pots. That's not our goal. And so this is specifically for 100 big blinds. As things get deeper, you have to actually call more because if you were to 4-bet, you're actually creating a larger disadvantage by being out of position in a larger pot, potentially. But with 100 big blinds, with 150 big blinds approximately, this will apply directly. And yeah, we don't want to be calling out of position. It's a terrible situation to be in. And so we really only want to do it with this select few hands that are just like going to play really well out of position and play pretty strongly, right? So, it's like, yeah, like we can understand why, we could probably play 9s out of position, Jack 10 suited, King Queen suited. Makes sense, right? And for the other hands, like we know we have to continue about 40% of the time here. when we open raise a tight range, we just would prefer to four bet these hands and put that pressure back on. And so it's like, we are going to be folding a majority of the time. So when we do four bet, it is a strong range and our opponents can't take advantage of it. And basically this is what this range shows you, is that, imagine three betting someone and having them come back at you with this range. Like it's not an easy thing to defend. And that's really what the GTO range is offering us.
There you go. And you mentioned the GTO, the pure GTO output over on the right. And this is what we're looking at over here. The tan hands represent kind of the same bluish ones over here. So those are your four bets. Yellows are still going to be your calls. Reds are going to be all of your folds. And you notice how complicated some of this stuff can be. I mean, if we're over here looking at, say, pocket nines in the GTO pure range, I mean, some percentage gets folded, a decent chunk gets called, and then some chunk of that also gets, four bet. And like, How do you make that decision in real time? And I know that was a large chunk of our goal when we were crafting the actual ranges for Pro and Core, is making those discernments in a way that, one, makes sense, is in alignment with the solver itself, and two, so you don't have to at the table, bring your D20 die with you and start rolling and figuring out what to do. Instead, you can, kind of just say, okay, to simplify things, I can throw nines into my calling range and go forward from there. So can you talk a little bit about what went into the GTO solver ranges and kind of pulling those out from the solver, which can be a little tedious, as I found out through this process?
Yeah, exactly. So actually that screenshot on the right is a program we use called Munker Viewer, which is, it's a tool. It gets the job done. I don't know how great I would say it is. I appreciate that it exists. But it's actually very complicated. So if we're looking at that, it looks like we're going to be calling fours, twos, threes 100% of the time, which is actually not true. So Munker Viewer is actually giving us a sort of percentage view of our original open raising range. So you can see in, those hands in red are the original open raising range that are being used here. And this is actually kind of the opening range. It's pretty close to what's being used on the left side charts as well. And within that, so we would only be open raising fours from the hijack here probably about 5 to 10% of the time, and then when we get three bet with it, we would actually call that 5 to 10% 100% of the time. And so that's what Munker Viewer is telling you, and it is pretty cumbersome to do. And you can just see, like, trying to memorize this, there's not even necessarily an easy display that represents the percentage that you open raise and then the percentage that you can continue, and would you even be able to see that difference? And so that pro range that we've built, you can just see how much simpler it is to memorize. And it is the exact same frequency as the GTO range there on the right. You're continuing and you're four betting with the exact same optimal frequency. You're just doing it with a easier to remember set of hands. And do you give a little bit up on that? Yeah, you give a little bit up. But the difference between having the right frequency of four bets and calls and just, kind of guessing your way through, that's a huge difference to your win rate. That's a huge difference in how difficult you are to play against. Whereas, making sure you have the exact perfect board frequency by, memorizing, you need to play fours 10% of the time from the hijack and then call it 100%. But, fives, you actually play, 80% of the time, and then you're going to fold, it's just way, way too complicated, I think, for what you get in terms of win rate for the average player. And so that's actually what's all built into your pro ranges here. You get all that simplified in a way that's going to make sense. It is a little challenging to remember, okay, I need to call ace jack suited, but four bet ace 10 suited, but it's way, way, way simpler than what we have there on the right. And that what would be just sort of the raw computer output.
Yep, makes total sense. One last thing that I think is important to talk about whenever we have ranges like this, and we have multiple core ranges, everything from RFI to facing open raises to three betting and facing three bets, etc. And sometimes we end up with these kind of discretionary hands. In this case, it's ace queen offsuit, it's pocket jacks. Can you just give like some general ideas on what goes into that discretion for someone who's maybe a little bit newer and looks at this and like, I surely don't feel comfortable four betting it. So I guess the
Yeah.
only discretion for me is how quickly do I want to call it? What goes into that decision for someone who's using the core range?
Yeah, it really is tricky to have discretion, especially at the beginning. But I think the thing I would say is, these are beginner-oriented ranges with the core ranges, and you can just say lean on the side. If you are uncomfortable playing that big pot out of position, and you're going to be really frustrated if you like lose a big pot, you want to work on that. It's very important in poker to be comfortable, like putting yourselves in situations where you may profit on average, but lose high percentage of those pots. You don't want to be afraid. You want to work on that. So, this is one of the few situations where, I'll give someone the go ahead and say, okay, you can call a little bit more than is optimal in this situation. Do work on it. Don't let it be the standard, but we understand like it's really uncomfortable playing four bet pots out of position. It just is. But in general, I would say is like, because this is a tight range and this is a tight four bet range, you're actually clear to just go ahead. If you don't really know what's going on and you're comfortable trying to attack and play that four bet pot, I would go for it. I would four bet basically jacks and ace queen offsuit here 100% of the time. It will be incorrect sometimes, your opponents would have never continued further with like hands that you beat or whatever, so that you're technically bluffing, but it doesn't matter. What happens is that when we have a very tight range, our frequencies are protected. And this is something that a lot of small players get really uncomfortable with, is that, okay, so I four bet jacks here, they shove on me, I pretty much have to call. And, they just had aces. And that feels so bad. It feels so bad when that happens, right? Like how many people do you think you talk to who are just like, oh, like I did this thing and then it went bad and they had aces?
Like a third of some coaching sessions is just like it's okay. You made the right decision. Like don't stress about it. Go back and rerun it meticulously. But yeah, it's fine. It is what it is. It happens sometimes. And also, you get on the good side of that sometimes too, and we forget to study those hands out too. So, yeah, it's not the worst thing in the world. It happens.
Yeah, it's so common. And if you look and see the actual optimal frequencies that we're recommending, look at how much tighter those core ranges are and how protected you are. Like you're not four betting too much, is what we're saying. Now, when that happens, the thing that I just like to think is like, you want to focus on the decision points and you want to focus on like, okay, what is my overall strategy and am I getting an advantage on average? That is the key thing that you have to focus on, is that, when we're giving you these sort of generalized pre-flop recommendations, whether it's the GTO strategy, it means you actually don't need to know how your opponents are playing, which is very powerful. And I think people oftentimes overassume that they understand how their opponents are playing. So, there is, an optimal strategy, let's say theoretically against an exact opponent, but you'll very rarely ever actually know that. And so just understand that when you are choosing pre-flop strategies, you're picking an average strategy and you will lose sometimes. That's built into playing pre-flop poker correctly. So,
Yep. And I guess one other thing. So I could see someone listening to this and being like, well, even that core range looks a little bit wider than I'd want to continue against a three bet while out of position. I don't think everyone looks at pocket eights comfortably. I mean, maybe, they're like, "Ah, fine, I guess I have to call, but they don't really even want to. And then ace five, or if ace five suited, like no chance. King 10 suited, like no chance. So all of a sudden their continuance frequency goes from like 8% and maybe starts dropping down to like 5% of hands or even possibly tighter. How do you convince that person to loosen up in this situation and because I mean, it's easy for someone who's say continuing with like half of their hijack RFI range to say like, okay, that's clearly too wide.
yeah.
But for someone who's like much tighter, like how do you convince that person to loosen up? And I mean, even if they're calling it a three bet pot, that's not really the most comfortable spot in the world. You're out of position. Some of these hands are still going to miss the flop a large chunk of the time. It's just what hands do. How do you talk to that person and convince them like, yeah, this is right. This is good. You have to do this. Where do you even start?
Yeah, so I think the thing to remember is that if we think about our, RFI range, and if you go to redchippoker.com/opens, you can kind of see what our recommended RFI ranges are. Basically, everything is built into balance. You know, when we're opening a certain range, there's the assumption that we're going to be getting 3-bet by opponents, and basically our first goal is always just to protect ourselves from getting massively exploited. And we do that essentially by having a continuance frequency. Our continuance frequency is what protects ourselves from being, 3-bet exploited by our opponents. If you do have an opponent that you're certain who just really can't 3-bet, we expect a very high degree of certainty when you're doing this type of deviation, but you actually can overfold. It's totally acceptable. There's a lot of small stakes opponents who really don't 3-bet aggressively, right? However, if you don't know, you really need to lean on ranges like this, in my opinion, because, first of all, this is just going to help you develop a sense of gravity of like, okay, this is my basic standard continue frequency, right? Knowing that is incredibly powerful because it just lets you kind of see, okay, when I do decide to deviate because I think my opponent's tight, maybe I'm just trimming a couple hands from this range, right? It may not be the entire range, or I'm reducing, the 4-bet for value range down a bit. And you can kind of like have the actual discretion versus just like being there in the moment. Most people just go, do I feel comfortable or do I not? Or do I feel like I'm ahead? And if you only think in terms of like being ahead, you will be playing too tight and you will be very exploitable. And if you get into games or situations where someone is 3-betting you aggressively, you may not be comfortable proceeding at that point. And so this is really your tool set against being protected against aggressive 3-betting. And while that may not be the standard situation in small stakes, it's one of the most important skills for moving up. And you'll be continually surprised with, I think, opponents who do 3-bet you even at smaller stakes. It's, playing 6max online recently, reviewing hands with students. It is not uncommon for people to come and attack your open raises. It's a great strategy. It's an effective strategy, and you really need to be ready for it.
Well said. No, I'm pretty good with this. You have any last minute thoughts on kind of these ranges or what's going into them or anything in general?
I would just say that, like the power of simplification is, I think, hugely on display here. It's like, I think when most people think about being protected against 3-betting, they look at that right range and they're just like, yeah, this is the perfect range. But the thing you have to understand is that pro range in the middle, that is a great range. Almost no one at 100 limit, 200 limit, 2-4 higher, it's like people are not defending the right frequency. So if you're able to defend the right frequency, be in about the right place that's ahead on average of your opponent, this is an enormous advantage that you may not be aware of that's available.
Well said. And if you are interested in getting any of our ranges, you can do so at redchippoker.com. You can grab our RFI ranges for free at redchippoker.com/opens, or grab the core or pro ranges in the appropriate membership. And of course, if you need anything at all or have any questions, please don't hesitate to leave a comment. And of course, thumbs up and subbing is always welcome too. But we will see you back later with another video. And in the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.